All right, hi there, and welcome to week 2 of Guide to the Old Testament. This week we are talking about how to read the Pentateuch. We'll talk about what the Pentateuch is as well. We've got our small group questions here, so go through those if you're there at home and think through them. They should be familiar from your homework. You'll notice the first question is, did you bring your Bible and your completed homework sheet to class? That is probably going to be the first question every week. Your small group is going to be your accountability for that homework. Keep in mind that those homework sheets are available online. You can see the link in the description to this video. We're going to come back especially to this second question right here because this is going to be pretty important to what we're talking about in the lesson. So, what promises did God make to Abram in Genesis 12, 1 through 9? Feel free to pause it and write down your answers or refer to your homework sheet for that one. But we're going to list out a pretty common threefold delineation of those promises. So we often say that when God made those promises to Abram in Genesis 12, 1 through 9, he promised Abram land, like a specific place that Abram would have as a possession. The land is called the land of Canaan, spelled like this. Canaan is where the Canaanites live. So it's not a land where Abram grew up or that he was even in when God first commanded him to go there. Not a place that he owns, but he says someday Abram's going to have it. And the second thing that he promises him is offspring. Sometimes you'll see people call it seed. He says that Abram's going to become a great nation. He's going to have all kinds of numerous descendants coming from him, which is, of course, kind of an open question at this point in the book because Abram has no children at all and he's old. And then the final one, land, offspring, and then blessing. He says that Abram is going to be a blessing, and even that all the families of the whole earth are going to be blessed through Abram. So these promises that God is giving to Abram, they don't just pertain to him, but they're going to kind of spread out through all the earth until all the families of the world are blessed through him and through his descendants. So that's kind of the three ways that we often think about the promises that God made to Abram. So let's look now at filling in some blanks. We mentioned that today's lesson is called How to Read the Pentateuch. So then, what is the Pentateuch? Well, the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are also called the Pentateuch. Pentateuch, a word that means 5 scrolls. It's a Greek word. And in fact, there's a Hebrew name for these 5 scrolls as well. Not Pentateuch, but the Torah, Hebrew word that means instruction or law. But usually in English, we call it the Pentateuch. And it's kind of like something like Lord of the Rings or any book or movie where it's one big story, but there's also parts to it. So, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they're all together one big book, but they're also kind of separate books too. And the main theme of the Pentateuch is the partial fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham. Keep in mind that Abraham and Abram is the same person. So don't get confused by that. Abram's name changes to Abraham in the story. But the main theme we're going to look at of the Pentateuch is the partial fulfillment of these promises that we talked about to Abraham. And so by the end of the story, some of these promises are going to be more or less fulfilled and other ones are not. So we'll be taking a look at that. Now what we're going to do next, we're really going to draw out, kind of chart visually what happens across these 5 books of the Pentateuch. This is something we're going to do regularly in our class. If you're the type that loves colors and wants to bring in colored pencils or something, then feel free to do that. But this just helps you get a feel on the 30,000 foot level of what's in the book. We'll come back and look specifically at the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus. But for now, we're thinking really, really high level generalizations of what's in these books. So we start out, as you probably know, in the book of Genesis with God's good creation. So we have those 6 days of creation and then the 1 day of rest. We have that repetition of God saying he saw that it was good, right? And it kind of opens the question, what was so good about that good creation? And again, we can kind of summarize it in 3 points. What was so good about God's good creation? Well, in the Garden of Eden, we had Adam and Eve, the first people living in the Garden of Eden. What you had was God's people, Adam and Eve, the humans, and they were in God's place. They're also in and enjoying and being blessed by God's presence. So they're in the Garden of Eden and they have a job to do. They're supposed to work and keep the garden and kind of spread God's glory and his rule over the whole earth. And so they have these 3 things in particular. They're his people, they're at his place, and they're in his presence. And that's important because that good creation is also where the Bible's headed, right? So as you know, hopefully, shortly after this story in Genesis, we get what's often called the fall in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve are not supposed to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but they do, and so they lose out on those good things. They're no longer God's people. They have to leave his place, and they're exiled from his presence in the Garden of Eden. They can't access the tree of life anymore because of their sin. And so the story of the Bible is about how do we get back here? How do we get back to where we're God's people and at his place and in his presence? But back here in Genesis, the story continues, chapters 3 through 11 or so, as really a downward spiral of sin. Things are getting worse and worse. Think of stories like Cain and Abel, the great flood of Noah as a judgment on the evil of humanity, the Tower of Babel, all those representing sin getting worse and worse among humans. But the turning point comes in Genesis 12 when we're introduced to Abram. And the promises that Abram receives. Now notice this about the promises. This is really important. That in a lot of ways, these 3 promises correspond to what we had over here. So we're talking about a land, a place that Abram's going to have, the land of Canaan. We're talking about offspring, in other words, a great people who are going to be God's people. And we're talking about the blessing that comes from being in God's presence, like Adam and Eve were. And so that's why we want to think of these 3 promises to Abram that we get in Genesis 12 and also chapter 15 and 17. We want to think of those as a rescue plan for the whole creation, right? Because remember, those promises of blessing are going to branch out to all the families of the earth. So the book of Genesis, then, is basically a genealogy. And it has lots of chapters that are just nothing but genealogy. You might have encountered them before and said, why on earth is this here? But the reason is because we're tracking along with those 3 promises. They pass from Abram to his son Isaac. And they pass from Isaac to Isaac's son Jacob. These are the 3 names that we often call the patriarchs, the fathers of the nation of Israel. Because Jacob's name actually gets changed, just like Abram's did, and Jacob's name becomes Israel. Israel means he wrestles with God, or something similar to that, which reflects the story of Jacob wrestling with God. Now, Jacob/Israel, he has 12 sons. Okay? And these sons and their descendants become known as the children or the people of Israel. Right? That's why it becomes the name of a nation, right? Like even today, there's the nation of Israel. They're all descended from Jacob/Israel. But all along through this story, we're tracking not just a family tree, but the promises that go with it. So there's stories along the way where, Abram comes alongside Isaac and gives him those blessings, kind of passes them on, and Isaac does the same thing with Jacob. And so we're not just keeping track of people, but also the hope of the whole world, right? That promise to get back to the good creation is being passed along as well. And in fact, by the time we turn the page to the book of Exodus, we have the children of Israel. They're now not in the land of Canaan, but they're in the land of Egypt. And it says that they've been fruitful and they've multiplied. They're now not just a few people living in the land of Egypt or 12 sons of Israel. They are a great nation, which is really significant because that goes back to this promise made to Abraham. The promise of offspring of a great nation is here being fulfilled in the very opening pages of Exodus. So this question here, as you read Exodus 1 through 2 and Deuteronomy 34, did those promises come up again? The answer is yes. Actually, right there. In Exodus 1, we've already seen one of the promises come up. That was a terrible check mark. There we go. So the people have been fruitful and they're multiplied, but of course there's a problem coming. A new Pharaoh comes over Israel and he enslaves the people of Israel. He puts them into slavery. And so the story of Exodus is about how God takes the people of Israel from slavery and through their leader Moses brings them out of Egypt. There's the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, and they end up at Mount Sinai. So let's draw us a little mountain here. Mount Sinai. Now, Mount Sinai is very significant in the story. So from right here in the middle of Exodus all the way to here, about a third of the way through Numbers, all of this time is the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. So they're not moving. It's like a year's worth of time, and they spend the whole time at Mount Sinai. So what are they doing there? Well, while they're there, God appears to them and talks to Moses on the mountain. He appears in a cloud, talks to Moses, and he makes a covenant, an agreement, that we call a relationship based on a promise, a covenant with the nation of Israel. Oftentimes, the most famous symbol of this covenant is the 2 tablets that have the 10 commandments on them. So Exodus 20 is where we get those 10 commandments listed out for the first time. But really the way that this covenant, this agreement with Israel works is God gives them a whole bunch of laws, which is why from here in Exodus all the way toward the end of Deuteronomy, we're going to repeatedly get these collections of laws kind of inserted into our story. And the idea of this agreement that's being made is that if Israel will keep these laws that God's giving them, if they'll obey him and only worship him, then they can have the promises given to Abraham. They can live in the promised land of Canaan. They can be a fruitful and numerous people, and they can be blessed as they live in God's presence. So the covenant made at Sinai is a way that the people of Israel can experience those promises to Abraham, if they obey. That's the big if, right? So the book of Leviticus, which has a terrible reputation of being a really boring book that no one would ever want to read, but actually is very important for what it teaches us within the Pentateuch, it's all about how to live in God's presence. It's all about how to live in God's presence. Because being in God's presence is quite dangerous, right? The Pentateuch and also the New Testament says that God is a consuming fire, right? He appears to the people of Israel in a pillar of cloud and also a pillar of fire. It's dangerous for a sinful and unholy people to be with God in his presence. And yet that's where they're supposed to be, right? The blessing that we're looking for comes from being in God's presence like it was in the Garden of Eden. So what do the people of Israel need to do if God's going to live among them? Well, they build a special tent according to God's instructions called the tabernacle. And then at that tent and associated with the priests who are at that tent, they have some things to do. They have to make certain kinds of sacrifices. There's laws about being ritually pure, clean versus unclean that they need to be in order to come to the tabernacle and worship God there. There's laws about morality that they need to follow. But all of it is even though the system is not one that we use anymore, like we don't have a tabernacle in that sense anymore, it's all about how do we live in God's presence and what are the obstacles that humans have because of sin to being in God's presence. So it's not really irrelevant or boring if you're willing to kind of read it carefully. Now, when we come to the book of Numbers, well, it's not the first time we've seen this, but we run into some problems. Okay, disobedience. So let's talk about it. Disobedience. Back here in the book of Exodus, we skipped over something important, which was that in the middle of giving this covenant where God said things like, you shall have no other gods before me and don't make any graven images, right in the middle of there in Exodus chapter 32, the people of Israel made a golden calf and worshipped that instead. They broke the laws. And in fact, something very similar happened over here in the book of Leviticus in chapter 10. Right after they received these laws about how to live in God's presence and the sacrifices they need to make, two of the priests named Nadab and Abihu, they did it the wrong way, and they actually got consumed by the consuming fire. They were burned up. And in the book of Numbers, we get the worst examples of disobedience yet. So, on the one hand, you have the people disobeying, people of Israel, the whole nation. On the other hand, you have Moses. So the people are commanded to leave Mount Sinai. It's time to go to the promised land. And they send spies to the promised land. And the spies say, well, the promised land's really scary. We're not sure we can defeat the people that live there already, so we're not going to go. Right? So total disobedience, total lack of trust in God. And you also have this story about Moses where he strikes the rock to bring water forth for the people. And it's kind of unclear, but in some way or another, he doesn't trust in God, doesn't believe God in that situation, and it's a failure, a disobedience on his part as well. So the punishment for this is quite remarkable. The people have to wander around in the wilderness between Egypt and the land of Canaan, the promised land. They have to wander around for 40 years until the whole generation that left Egypt has died off. Right? Only their minor children are left over. So this is a huge, huge deal. We've gotten this good covenant from God at Sinai, a way that the people can get back to how things were at the good creation. The problem is that it requires just one little thing from the people, which is that they actually obey, and they're not doing it. They're disobeying instead. So in Deuteronomy is really a bunch of speeches by Moses, essentially. And you can think of them as a review and an evaluation, right? How are things going? How are things going? And Moses takes a look back at these laws in light of all the stories that have been told so far. As he reviews a lot of things that have already been said, and he says, it is not going well, and it probably will continue to not go well. The reason being that the heart of the people, he says their heart is uncircumcised. It doesn't belong to God. It's a disobedient heart that they have because they're humans. I mean, we learned that all the way back in Genesis 6, that every thought or intention of the human heart was only evil always, right? And so the same problem is persisting. We have good laws, a good covenant, but if it depends on the people being obedient, well, it's not working out very well. And so Moses also looks to the future, and he says it's going to continue to go badly. The people are going to keep disobeying, and they're going to get into the promised land, but eventually they're going to follow other gods and go after idols and be disobedient, and God's going to send them into exile. They are not going to get to keep this promise of the land and of being in God's blessed presence and having numerous and fruitful offspring. Those things are not ultimately going to happen through this covenant of the law. But, and there is a but, there's something to look forward to as Moses looks to the future, which is that after that exile and that losing of the promised land, God is going to do something new. He's going to give his people a new and a good heart. He calls it a circumcised heart. It's going to be a new kind of covenant. Okay, so in the prophets it's called the new covenant. And it's going to be a kind of heart that the people will have where they'll be able to obey God. So Moses does have some hope for the future, but it's not grounded in the covenant made at Sinai so much. It's really focused on those promises to Abraham as they'll be fulfilled when Israel has a new heart. And so the ending of Deuteronomy and of the whole Pentateuch is like completely striking. And you read this this week as well in Deuteronomy 34. So Moses is on another mountain. This is not Sinai, even though you might notice it looks identical to Sinai over there. Moses is on another mountain. You can tell it's Moses because Moses has a beard. And Moses, he looks out over the promised land. It's over here. Maybe we'll draw a promised land. He looks out and he gets to see it. And God says, there it is. That's where everybody's going. And then Moses dies and he does not get to go in. So it's a very sad and surprising ending. And that's why we say the theme of the Pentateuch is the partial fulfillment of the promise to Abraham, because we have offspring, yes, and we have God's presence with the Israelites in the tabernacle and blessing them, and we're heading toward the land, but, it just doesn't seem like it's going to work out. The people are disobeying. Even Moses himself, who's the leader and the protagonist for much of this story, he gets right to the edge of the promised land, but because of his disobedience, he dies. He gets to see it, but he doesn't get to go there. So that's a 30,000-foot overview of the Pentateuch. There's 100 million details that I've overlooked and skipped over, and they're all important. But this is just trying to get us into the big picture of what's happening as we read these kind of difficult and involved books. Now, what I do want to point out as we kind of finish up here, there are three kinds of passages we're going to encounter in the Pentateuch. The first one, we're going to see lots of stories, right? Passages that are narratives. We're looking at things like characters and themes and plot, tension and climaxes, things that we're kind of used to maybe from our literature classes. We're also going to encounter lots of laws. And one of the important things to know about these laws in the Pentateuch is to remember this perspective that Moses had about the laws, that the laws are good, but they're not really sufficient, right? So the main point that the Pentateuch makes about the laws isn't that you should really obey them all, right? They're laws given specifically to Israel under this old covenant that as Christians, we're not a part of that covenant, really. And so we need to be careful about thinking that these laws are spoken directly to us. Right? They're for us, and they're for us to read, and we see God's wisdom in them. But like when the Pentateuch says that we can't eat shellfish or something like that, that's not a law that applies to us. We might talk about that some more later. But the last kind of passage we're going to see is poems. And a lot of the future hope of the Pentateuch is carried in these poems. Particularly poems that look forward to a certain king. It's a terrible crown, but you're going to have to live with it. A king who will come from the line of Judah. Judah is one of these offsprings of Israel, one of his children. And a king who's going to defeat the enemies of God and rule righteously and bring about prosperity. And so that hope for a king that's carried along in these poems is also a big part of what Moses is kind of looking forward to here at the end of the book. The two kind of hopes that the Pentateuch sets out are this new circumcised heart, the new covenant that goes with it, and then the king, who we'll eventually come to know as the anointed one, right? In Hebrew, Mashiach, the Messiah. Okay, we'll talk about that some more as we go. Let's look at our homework. So we're listening to next week. So just to be clear, this was our lesson on the whole Pentateuch as an overview. Now we're going back and we're talking about Genesis. We're going to spend 2 weeks just on Genesis. And so next week we're reading some of the opening passages of Genesis, Genesis 1, 2, and 3, Genesis 11. Be sure to follow along in your own Bible as you listen to those passages. Follow this link to see that there. And some questions here. Some of these are easy. List some of the good things that God gave Adam and Eve to enjoy in the Garden of Eden. You should be able to crush that one. And then there's some questions that are hard. Why do you think God told Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Now, that's a stinking hard question. So don't feel like the point of this is to make sure you get the right answers to all of them, but they're about getting you to be thinking about the right topics, the things that we're going to talk about in class. So I hope that's been helpful to you, and thanks for watching this video. We will see you next week.